Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my hands-on first looks review of the Fujifilm XF 18mm f1.4, a wide-angle prime lens for the X series mirrorless system. Announced in April 2021 and costing $999 or £879, the XF 18mm delivers standard wide-angle coverage equivalent to 27mm when mounted on an X series body like the XS10 here. It's a higher-end alternative to the existing 18mm f2 pancake lens with an extra stop of aperture and weather sealing, albeit larger and roughly 50% more expensive. Meanwhile, the new 18 1.4 costs around the same as the earlier 16mm 1.4, which is equivalent to 24mm coverage if you prefer something a bit wider. The 28mm focal length, or thereabouts, falls roughly between the mild 35s and wider 24s, capturing a respectable field of view while avoiding dramas with distortion or perspective. They're the safe wide-angle choice, ideal for a wide variety of subjects, and today, in a market flooded by new 24s and 35s, actually feel almost exotic. Ironic, since back in the day they were typically the second lens everybody bought after a standard 50. Fujifilm asked that I describe my test sample as a pre-production lens, although it did arrive in what looked like final packaging, and the lens itself performed without complaint in my test, so I suspect it's pretty close to final. As always, I'll update my review page at cameralabs.com with sample images from a final model once available. At 69 by 76mm and weighing 370 grams, the XF18 1.4 is similar in size and almost identical in weight to the earlier 16mm 1.4. The only key difference in dimensions is a slightly narrower barrel, in turn allowing smaller 62mm filters versus 67 on the wider lens. For the record, the older 18mm f2 is a little narrower still, allowing 52mm filters, but most obviously it's less than half the length and 1/3 the weight, so if ultimate portability is important to you, order the pancake. As a WR lens, the 18 1.4 is dust and moisture resistant, a benefit both it and the 16 1.4 share over the older 18mm f2, which sadly isn't sealed. In terms of controls, the 18 1.4 is equipped with an aperture ring running between 1.4 and f16 in 1/3 EV increments, with a satisfying click between them. There's a lock button to hold it in the A position for aperture control via the body if preferred, but there's no declickable option. That said, recent Fujifilm bodies do allow silent adjustment of the aperture in movie mode via the touchscreen, again in 1/3 EV increments. There's a substantial manual focusing ring which turns smoothly and operates with motor assistance, although the lens strangely lacks the pullback clutch mechanism of the earlier 16 1.4 and 23 1.4 that also revealed depth of field markings. I'm not entirely sure why Fujifilm didn't implement it on this new lens. Fujifilm supplies the 18 1.4 with a plastic petal lens hood that twists on with a bayonet fitting, and again the filter measures 62mm. Now for my test, starting with focus in single AFS mode recorded through an XS10 body with the lens open to f1.4. Here you can see it's pretty swift, albeit with a minor contrast-based wobble to confirm at each end. Remember, this is a pre-production lens, so the performance may change. The lens employs a linear motor and felt pretty quick in day-to-day use. Here's the same test again at f1.4, but using the XS10's 4K movie mode with continuous AFC mode. In this mode, the camera relies on phase detect autofocus alone to more confidently stop at the subject without the contrast-based confirmation, and while the refocusing briefly pauses at times, it's similar to my experiences when testing other Fujifilm bodies and lenses. Here it is again, refocusing on me using eye detection in the movie mode, and I'm using the flattish Eterna film simulation for my video samples here. As before, the tracking is pretty smooth and accurate, only occasionally losing me or playing catch-up. Sony and Canon remain the leaders at face and eye detection in movies, but Fujifilm has done a great job and I'd be happy relying on their autofocus system while presenting a piece to camera. While I'm talking about focusing, here's a brief test for focus breathing, where I've closed the aperture to f16 and manually focused from infinity to the closest distance and back again. Between infinity and around 1 meter, the 18mm 1.4 exhibits minimal focus breathing, with only the mildest magnification. But between 1 meter and the closest focusing distance, the breathing accelerates, becoming much more obvious. This non-linear change can be quite distracting if you focus across this transition of distances, but if you stick to between 1 meter and infinity, breathing won't be a major issue. Again though, this was a pre-production sample. The closest focusing distance is quoted as 20 centimeters, or that's about 10 centimeters from the very front of the lens, allowing you to get really close to subjects. Here's a ruler photographed from as close as I could focus, reproducing a subject width of 14 cm across the frame. And even with the lens open to f1.4, the details remain pretty sharp right up to the edges. I've got lots more close-up examples later in the review because it's a really fun way to use this lens. Next for a bokeh test, and you're looking at the wider part of the aperture range here starting at f1.4 and with the lens focused very close to its minimum distance. The lens is rendering attractive bokeh, mostly avoiding the sharp edges and textured blobs of lesser lenses. Now, it's not the absolute cleanest bokeh that I've seen, but it remains a visible step up from Fujifilm's cheaper or smaller lenses. Here's a closer look at those blobs, which, like most large aperture lenses, are cat's-eye shaped towards the corners at the largest apertures, but become mostly circular by around f2.8. At about f4 and smaller, the 9-bladed diaphragm becomes more identifiable as a geometric shape, but again at larger apertures the shape is fairly circular and well behaved. Okay, next for a portrait test with the aperture wide open, again with the pre-production 18mm on an XS10 body. 28mm equivalents may not be your first choice for portrait work, but wides can be fun for environmental compositions where you see more of the surroundings, and if you're careful with the distance and position on the frame, you can minimise distortion. Taking a closer look shows a decent degree of detail around my eyes and beard, while towards the sides you'll see the background is rendered smoothly, again avoiding the undesirable outlining or textured patterns of cheaper lenses. It's certainly a practical option, especially for group shots. Moving further away, here's my distant landscape shot, angled as always so that details extend right into the corners where lenses struggle the most. I took this with the pre-production 18mm at f1.4 on an XS10 body. Zooming into the middle for a closer look reveals plenty of fine detail out of the gate, and there's no need to close the aperture to boost it further. As you move into the far corners, my test sample became a little softer, and like most larger aperture lenses also exhibited some darkening due to vignetting. Both gradually improved as the aperture closed though, and by f4 on my own test sample, the picture had become pin sharp in the corners. It's possible to achieve this with a larger aperture by repositioning the focus area to the corner, but I always perform this particular test with a central AF area. Okay, now it's time for my verdict so far, and as I wrap up my first impressions, I'll show you a selection of photos I took with a pre-production XF 18mm 1.4 on an XS10 body, and as always they're all JPEGs straight out of camera with no manipulation. Head over to my review of the lens at cameralabs.com to access the original files. The Fujifilm XF 18mm 1.4 is a high-performance wide-angle lens for X-series mirrorless cameras, with a flexible 27mm field of view and a bright aperture that allows attractive shallow depth of field effects. In my test so far with a pre-production sample, the quality stayed sharp across most of the frame at the maximum aperture for subjects near and far, while the rendering of blurred areas was smooth and undistracting. Shooting at around 28mm with a prime lens also felt surprisingly fresh. I feel 28mm lenses, or thereabouts, have fallen out of fashion recently, with many companies concentrating on the lengths on either side. So there's plenty of new 24s and 35s, but unusually very little in between. The XF 18mm reminded me why 28mm was, for a very long time, the second most common lens after a standard 50, and I enjoyed the compositional flexibility, not to mention the respectable close-up capabilities and the chance for some nice blurring in the background. As a premium Fujifilm lens, it's not cheap, but it is priced similarly to the previous 16 1.4, which provides a wider alternative. If your budget demands something cheaper, or you prefer a more compact lens, there's the 18mm f2 Pancake at around 2/3 the price. And as a pre-production lens, that's all I can say for now. Are you fond of 28mm lenses, or do you prefer the focal lengths on either side? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy my reviews, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.